4, 3, 2, 1, 0.
High and low, it's how I roll. A shooting star in a film noir. I'm floating around 10 feet over the ground. I'm floating around 10 feet over the ground. I am no average Joe. Be with me, and you will see more than you ever wanted to.
Hey there, folks. It's John Baranchak here. Thanks for everybody attending. I'm really excited about this show, really excited to share information with you. So we're just going to jump right into it. Just by way of housekeeping, I think the first thing I'd like to do is to thank a few people for making this possible. I especially want to thank Doug and Alex Hychek for believing in me and my message and helping me deal with the technology. If any of you know me personally, you know I am not a friend to social media, and they have really made this easy for me. I also want to thank Jeff Carpenter, Kevin Zork, and TJ and company. Those three folks are expedition friends of mine, and were really encouraging with me in making this show possible through making my book possible. Right now, my book is entitled, it's entitled Psychological Horizons in Scientific Bigfoot Research. But that's going to be republished under Hangar One Publications, which is Doug Hychek's publishing company. And we're going to do some additions to the show and add some QRL codes so that instead of having to go through all the hassle of searching and this and that, you'll be able to scan those into your computer and go and see and hear some of the things that are in the book. And I'm really, really excited about that. I'm going to ask you all to help me out. I'm kind of a one-man show here in this case. So as a result, I'm dealing with the tech as the show goes on, for one thing. And this is all new to me. So as a result, by all means, continue to talk amongst yourself as you'd like. But if you have a question, I'd appreciate it if you type that question in capital letters so I recognize it as a question. And I'm going to try, we'll see how it goes. I'm going to try to take questions as they come up. We've got about an hour show, give or take. So your initial questions, they should be related to the topic that I'm discussing at that time. And I'm going to try and allow a little bit of time towards the end to answer more general questions. Also, by way of introduction, I'd like to just briefly discuss the underpinnings of Grasping Sasquatch, which will be the name of the book when it's republished. I was inspired to write this book after being on some expeditions. And one of the things I noticed on expeditions was there's a couple chasms in the Bigfoot community. One of those chasms is between folks like myself who advocate for science, as well as the folks whose expeditions I was on, which is more of an experiential or a phenomenologic expedition. To that end, the book is designed and in the hopes of bridging that gap between science and experiential research, giving those folks that don't have the scientific background personal self-help to kind of recondition your autonomic nervous system, your fight-flight response, so that you can hopefully remain calmer. I'm not sure that you want to be absolutely calm if you have a Class A experience, but you also don't want your fight-flight reaction to run amok and you end up running or having some other unpleasant experiences. So that's kind of speaks to the first part of the book. And then the second part of the book is about how to apply psychological science, such as experimental design and statistics. I've frequently heard on expeditions, especially from the folks who are into what I'm using, not in a derogatory term, but because it's the term I've been introduced to, and that is the folks that are into the woo phenomena. I've repeatedly heard that science just isn't up to the task to be able to study those phenomena. And I think that psychological science is definitely tailor-made to not only study to not only help people study the flesh and blood believers, or not the believers, but the folks who believe in flesh and blood to study Sasquatch, but also for the folks who are in the woo school of thought to be able to use these techniques to study things like zapping, infrasound, and I've got a mind speak experiment that I've been kicking around my head. I try and remain kind of neutral in coming down in one camp or another, because I believe that we really need to think about and study Sasquatch or Bigfoot or whatever you'd like to call it, and to learn, not just to advance ideas that become theories, but to bring the scientific process to the expeditions and to the study of Sasquatch, so that we can know things rather than assuming things. So to that end, we're going to visit a few quotes here. For your consideration, the eye sees only what the mind is prepared to comprehend. Robert Davies. I don't imagine we'll have too many skeptics attending our show, but it's not surprising that there are skeptics out there. If their mind can't comprehend the possibility, at least, of this creature Sasquatch existing, they're certainly not going to be able to have that experience. And if you've been on any expeditions, you've also probably heard that you've got to approach it with an open mind and an open heart, and you'll be more likely to have these guys come out and show themselves. So I think, hopefully the book will be serve as preparation, if you will, for the comprehension, and then for people to actually be able to see Sasquatch. I myself have not had a type A encounter. I had some really cool type B experiences, one of which I'm going to share tonight. So I'm still one of those whose eyes are trying to see and experience that type A encounter. The second quote that I'd like you guys to consider is, one of the biggest problems with the world today is that we have large groups of people who will accept whatever they hear on the grapevine just because it suits their worldview, not because it's actually true or because they have evidence to support it. The really striking thing about this is that it wouldn't take too much effort to establish the validity of these cases. And again, I think that, again, that speaks to the purpose of the book, educating people on science in the hopes that science can come to this process along with the experiential. Supposed to start a presentation with a joke. Some of you who have seen me present before may have heard this joke. A policeman sees a drunk searching for something under a streetlight and asks what the drunk has lost. He said he's lost his keys, and they both started looking under the streetlight together. After a few minutes, the policeman asks, "Are you sure this is where you lost your keys?" And the drunk replies, "No, I lost them out in the park." The policeman asks, "Why are you searching here under the light?" The drunk replies, "This is where the light is." I can't hear you laughing or not. I'm not a very good joke teller, but I think this joke really applies to what is happening in the Bigfoot community. Some stellar names in the field: Jeff Meldrum, Ron Moorhead. Jeff, of course, studying footprints and footprint casts, and Ron Moorhead, of course, studying audio and Bigfoot communication. They have shown the light. They're shining that flashlight on those two areas. Not surprisingly, as a result, when you go on an expedition, auditory stimuli, auditory sounds like tree knocks, growls, howls, whoops. We're out there trying to record those things and use that as evidence that Sasquatch, in fact, exists. Similarly, with the footprints, we're always looking for footprints. We want to take pictures of them, put down a dollar bill or something like that to provide a perspective on the size of the footprint. And then we will frequently cast them in order to take a look at the results more closely. And I kind of alluded to this earlier. And this isn't anything official, but this is how I kind of view things. We've got a large group of subjective phenomenological expeditions or experiential expeditions. That is the only type of expedition I've ever really been on. And then in the small blue circle there, you'll notice the scientific experimental school of thought. And you'll notice that in this diagram, we've got very little overlap. There's very little overlap between the scientific folks and the experiential or phenomenological folks. I think there is a little bit of overlap there, but because of this, we're frequently at odds with each other. If I was going to update this slide, I think part of what I would do is I would put two more circles in here, one for woo phenomena and one for flesh and blood phenomena. And they'd probably be separate. I don't know too many people that believe in woo that also believe in flesh and blood, and vice versa. Not too many flesh and blood folks believe in woo phenomena. Although I will point out to you guys that they don't have to be mutually exclusive. This could be, and I'm not saying it is, but this could be a flesh and blood creature that nonetheless has special abilities to shift between dimensions or materialize and dematerialize. So we don't necessarily have to have that chasm between woo phenomena and the flesh and blooders. On one of the expeditions I attend most of my expeditions have been with Lori Wade of BFRO and Charlie Raymond of BFRO. And I don't know if they're here or not, but if they are, hello. Both these folks put on excellent expeditions. Very, very good. Both are super people. Part of any expedition is debriefing after you come back. Come back at night, hit the hay, wake up the next morning, have breakfast, and then talk about what people experienced during the expedition. And then on Sunday, typically the final day of an expedition, you'll have that group debriefing as well. And one Sunday, one of the BFRO investigators was talking to a newbie or somebody who was on their first expedition. And this person was sharing his idea that the number of tree knocks a Bigfoot makes reflects either the number of Bigfoots in the area or the number of number in the research subgroup. Typically you go out in groups of 3 to 6. I kind of felt incredulous about this because I perceived this person speaking about this as if it was a fact. And rarely being someone to hold back my opinion, I stood up and in a very authoritative tone and quite insensitive tone in hindsight, declared that we weren't doing scientific research on these expeditions. We were using portions of the scientific method, but that doesn't make the research scientific. And for people on these expeditions frequently like to put the label of a scientific researcher onto either the expedition or to themselves. And so I'm sure I hurt some feelings in saying that, but I said it nonetheless. I did a rather poor job in doing so, unfortunately. I think that the BFRO website, where I took this quote from, says it a lot better. The use of subjective evaluation is what separates the legal perspective of witness testimony from the scientific perspective. Witness reports are considered anecdotal evidence by science, and you've heard that all we can provide right now of evidence in Bigfoot is anecdote stories. This anecdotal evidence is considered anecdotal and non-scientific mainly because they are not testable. However, in the history of science, scientific evidence has never been collected or even pursued until there has been enough anecdotal or indirect evidence at hand to merit an effort to collect the testable evidence. Thus, without the collection and evaluation of anecdotal evidence or indirect evidence, there would be no scientific discoveries at all. This is the intrinsic relationship between these two schools of thought and these two types of evidence. Citing reports by themselves are not scientific evidence, but they are what leads to scientific evidence. And this is why I feel it's important for us to mend fences for science and experiential research to work together, because we need each other. We need the phenomenologic and the experiential expeditions, because that helps shine the light again on some of the phenomena that the scientists need to investigate. So rather than building brick walls between each other, I think our best opportunity or our best chance of proving Bigfoot exists is in fact to work in cooperation with each other. And in my mind, this is what that would look like. You notice there's a large overlap between the scientific and the experiential expeditions. In my model, we've still got some pure scientific research going on, and we've still got some pure experiential expeditions going on. But you'll notice the arrow across there. We've got to cross-fertilize or cross-pollinate the pure experiential research with the scientific research, and the scientific research with the experiential research. And so if I could wave a magic wand and have my way with expeditions, I'd like for expeditions to both include the subjective experiential type expeditions, but at the same time do some scientific research as well. So, anybody have any questions so far? I'm about to move on to the two stories. The format of my show is going to be to tell stories or read encounters associated with Sasquatch or Bigfoot, and then try and allow the science that's included in my book, bring that in to better inform that experience. And so before I read my stories, I wonder if anyone has any questions. If you don't, that's okay. It's not necessary. Any questions? Not seeing any pop up. Okay. So my first story. I met a person who went out on an expedition, and this person had already had, I'd say, 2 or 3 Class A encounters where this person saw Bigfoot clearly and pretty up close and personal, as it were. But he went out on an expedition with 3 other researchers, 3 other investigators, and they were hiking the trail. One of the investigators decided to hike ahead of the group, while the other 3 held back on the trail and rested a little. It can get pretty tiring hiking those trails, and this was during a daytime hike, by the way. And as the 3 in the group are resting, getting ready to move on, all of a sudden, a Sasquatch stands up from behind the brush. And honestly, I can't be certain of the number of yards or feet it was seen in. As I recall the story, it was probably somewhere between 25 and 50 yards. And so as this person's telling me this story, I asked the person the same question that many people had asked this person, and many of you might want to ask this person: did you get a picture? And this person says to me, John, you know, when you poop and pee in your pants, the last thing you think about is snapping a picture. And that pooping and peeing in your pants, that's an example of the fight-flight reaction that comes with some type A encounters. Not everybody who sees Bigfoot poops and pees in their pants, but it wasn't just these 3. If you talk with enough people who have had these encounters, they have a variety of fight-flight responses. And sometimes losing control of their bladder and bowel is part of that experience. It's nothing to be ashamed of. That's nothing you can consciously control unless you train how to control that. And learning to modulate or control that will be part 2 of this episode and this show. Next week, we'll talk about some techniques that you can learn for yourself to be able to reprogram your fight-flight response. But for most folks, that's not under voluntary control. The anxiety and the fear hits you, and you either fight or you flee, or you might poop and pee in your pants. So again, nothing to be embarrassed about, but the person that was telling me this story kind of blushed as he told me that not only did he, but all 3 of the people that had that experience, 3 of them pooped and peed their pants. The guy who walked ahead didn't have the encounter, so his underwear were clean. Interestingly enough, when I went on my first expedition, the leader sent out a list of things you need to pack, not only for camping, but encouraging people to take an expedition pack that you carry with you when you actually go out in small groups and look for it, look for Bigfoot. And on that list was a change of underwear and a change of clothes. And I never really understood why that might be until I heard this story. So that's part of the fight-flight reaction and response. The second story I'm going to now tell you is a story that's in my book, the original book at this point, which is still available on Amazon, Psychological Horizons in Scientific Bigfoot Research. By training, I've got my PhD in psychology. I am at this point retired as a psychologist and neuropsychologist because of medical issues. But at the time that I started my expeditions, I was still working in my private practice as a neuropsychologist, pain psychologist, and clinical psychologist. And as I went on those expeditions, I began to realize that there's, psychology and psychological science could help in this process. At any rate, I was in a subgroup of 4. I believe it was about 16. This is, if you by chance have that book, well, I brought up the book. If you by chance have this book, it's on pages 102 to 104, should you have it handy and want to follow along. I'm not going to be reading it from the book. I'm going to tell it to you in my own words nonetheless. Of course, non-disclosure clauses prevent me from giving you the details of the location of where this happened. But like many expeditions, we were in a fairly public camping ground, but then when we would divide up into groups, we'd go back in the woods, back on trails. And on this expedition, 4 groups of 4 decided to go to what I'm going to call a midway base camp. We drove to the foot of the mountain where this was, and then we walked. The organizers, of course, had pallets down to act as bridges, but I think we had to cross at least 3 or 4 streams down low before we got to the path to follow this slope up the mountain. So all 16 of us hiked up halfway up the mountain, and there was a cabin there, a very rustic cabin. And so one group of 4 stayed stationed at that cabin. Another group of 4 walked, I'm going to call it, to the right around the pinnacle, or the higher up on the mountain. And I was in a group of 4 that once we got higher up on the mountain, we took a left. And the goal was to meet the other group coming around. But of course, we took the wrong way. We misunderstood which way we were supposed to be going. Some people who have become very good friends of mine were in this group. A gentleman by the name of Mark Ogleby, a gentleman by the name of George Wrigley, and a gentleman by the name of Dan Kegley, who since this experience I have renamed Braveheart. And you'll understand why I call him Braveheart as we get to this story. So it had rained heavy the night before, and as we started walking up our path, to our left was, and we're walking on a fire road, actually, old forest road. To our left was a drop off, and to our right was more of the peak, the mountain itself. And we walked single file up this mountain, and all you could hear were the leaves rustling in the wind and the water draining down the mountain. And I was still pretty new in my Bigfoot experiences at this time. And so as we were walking up this forest road, this logging road, I asked George, I said, George, you've told me several times that sometimes when a Bigfoot is in the area, it gets deadly silent like this. And those of you who have been on expeditions, you may have experienced that, where the forest just gets silent. There should have been tree frogs going off, crickets chirping, wildlife scattering in the leaves, and we didn't hear any of that, none of that. And George says, well, John, usually when you have that kind of silence and a Bigfoot is in the area, your spider senses are going to start tingling. You're going to get the sense that you're being watched or observed. So I really don't think that this is that kind of silence. So we continued to hike uphill up this forest road for quite a while, trying to radio to the other group to make sure they were going to kind of meet us in the middle. Well, you don't always have good communication via walkie-talkies in the mountains because certain things will block that signal. So we couldn't get a hold of them. We just kept walking and walking and walking. Finally, we got a hold of them. But as we were walking, we saw no wildlife whatsoever. None. At one point, we finally got a hold of the other group that we were hoping to meet. And that's when we discovered we should have headed right rather than the left we took. But we asked them while we had a signal, have you guys seen any wildlife? Oh yeah, we spooked some turkeys that were on the ground. We spooked some turkeys roosting, flying out of the trees when we came on them. We spooked and seen some deer, and the path, the forest road that we're walking on, is completely uprooted and muddy from wild pigs rooting in the mud looking for food. And we saw nothing, heard nothing except the leaves rustling in the trees and the water trickling down the hill. So when we realized we took a wrong turn and been hiking uphill this whole time, we said, to heck with this. We're going to turn around and go back down to the cabin. The silence was still deafening in our section of the forest. As we were walking down, because of my training as a psychologist, for some reason, I was a fascinating person to this group of researchers. And oftentimes when I'd be out with these folks, we'd talk about hypnosis and things like that. And George was really interested in hypnosis and suggestion and trying to tie that into Bigfoot reports and people seeing Bigfoot and their experiences and wondering if there could be hypnotic phenomena going on. And so we're walking in single file, George in front of me behind George, Dan Kegley, Braveheart behind me, and George and Mark Ogleby bringing up the rear. Usually I'd be bringing up the rear. And we were talking about hypnosis, and I made some kind of point about hypnosis that really struck George, kind of slapped him in the face. And he stopped, pivoted on his heel, and we were about 5 feet apart, walked that 5 feet apart and began to say my name, but all he got out was J, the first syllable of my name. Well, it's a one syllable name, but the first letter of my name. And as he said J, we heard what sounded like a bomb going off, but it was a tree either falling down or being pushed over. And then immediately after that tree went down, we heard what sounded like either rocks or other trees tumbling down the steep face of the mountain. And if you've ever been involved in a landslide or a rock slide, as the rocks and the logs roll down the hill, occasionally they'll hit a rock on the ground and become airborne, and the sound of the rocks tumbling stops until it hits the ground again and starts tumbling again. And this was going on all around us. I'd say probably at least a 50-yard path, or not path, a swath of the road with us kind of in the middle of it. And when that tree went down and the landslide happened, we all had our own unique fight-flight reactions. George and I, we ran like cockroaches further down the trail in the hopes of avoiding getting caught in this landslide. Mark Ogleby thought better of coming forward and ran back up the road a little bit because, again, I think all four of us were certain we were about to get wiped out in a landslide. But Dan Kegley, God bless his soul, he, instead of running, he turned and pivoted and looked up the hill and made a grab for his K-bar knife and was standing ready to fight. So 3 of us fled, and Dan Kegley, Braveheart, he decided he was going to fight. And so I think that's a good example of how different people can react differently to a fight-flight situation. 3 of us fled, and one of us, Braveheart, he decided he was going to fight. Well, when you're on an expedition like this and you have an experience like this, your first job is to try and debunk what this could have been before you assign the experience to Sasquatch. So we all started looking up the hill with our lights. And as we're looking up the hill with our lights, I noticed that in my light beam, these little particles of dust started trickling down. And no sooner I noticed the particles of dust, I began to smell loam. I'm not sure how many of you know what loam is, but it has a kind of musky, deep, earthy kind of smell. And so we stood there, and I don't know for how long the loam continued to come down. The the tree falling or being pushed down, and then what I called the landslide sounds. George had a recorder on, and those lasted 14, that event lasted 14 seconds. I had a recording of it. George offered up a recording, but it really didn't do it justice. It sounded more like water running down a stream. And so I decided not to include that in the podcast, because when that tree went down, it was like a bomb went off. And then when that landslide, it sounded like a landslide just was going to come down on top of us. I mean, we were all fearful for our lives, including, I think, Braveheart, but he decided to fight for his life rather than run for his life. No sooner that settled down, the people down at the cabin said, radioed up to us, "Did you guys hear that tree be pushed over or fall down?" We kind of said, yeah, we thought it was going to come down on top of us. Of course we heard it. How could we not, being up here? So we stood there and we're looking up the hills, trying to see anything signifying a landslide. Interestingly enough, other than the loam coming down, not a single rock hit the roadbed. Not a single log hit the roadbed. No leaves came down off the mountain and hit the roadbed. We never looked to the left of the road down the slope, because the sound definitely happened from upslope. So after spending about 30 minutes trying to debunk it and not finding anything, we were probably about 150, 200 yards from the steep path that led down to the cabin. And we started walking down towards that steep path. And we hadn't gone 25 yards. And the people down at the cabin radioed up to us. And they said, "Are you walking down the steep part of the trail, or are you still on the logging road?" And we were kind of irritated at that point with them remaining in constant contact with us. We said, "We're walking down the fire road out." So we got to the steep path and we started walking down that slippery steep path. You had to really go slow to avoid slipping and falling. And as we're going slow down this ultra steep path, the guys from the cabin radioed up to us again. "Are you guys still on the fire road, or are you on the steep path?" "We're on the steep path. For goodness sakes, why do you keep asking these questions?" "Well, when you were walking down the fire road, we saw what looked like red lights lagging behind you, following you down. And now that you're on the steep path, we saw what looked like red lights following you down the steep path." And one of the forms of eye shine that Bigfoots exhibit, or eye glow, depending on your theory or belief, is that they can emit red eye shine. And so when we heard that they had just seen it on the steep path behind us, of course, we swiveled our heads and shined our lights up there. We didn't see a thing. We saw nothing. We continued on down to the cabin, and by this time, all 16 of us were gathered at the cabin, and we just decided we were going to rest a little bit to get ready to take the final hike down. But as we were getting ready to leave, somebody said, "Look at that. Look out in the woods there." And we all looked, And he said, I swear I saw a red light or a red eye peep out behind a tree. And we looked and looked, and all of a sudden, all of us saw, we call them peepers, peeping out from behind the tree, going behind the tree, then peeping out the other side of the tree. You could only see one red eye at a time, but this wasn't just happening. This just wasn't happening behind one tree. This was happening behind a grove of trees. I don't know. We got so excited and wound up. Probably 15 to 20 peepers, I would estimate we saw. And we sat there and for about 30 minutes watched these things peeping their heads out behind a tree. Now, this constitutes a Class B experience because we couldn't definitively identify that as Sasquatch because we couldn't make out the bodies. All we were seeing was the red eye glow. And that's not necessarily enough to qualify as a Class A experience. So after the peepers stopped peeping, we left and went back to our main base camp. But before we headed down to this steep slope, we set 2 sticks right where this avalanche and tree fall happened. And I think I'm the oldest one in the group, but none of us are spring chickens anymore. But we were determined to hike back up there the next day and look in the daylight, see if we could find anything. Well, you wake up the next morning and you're stiff and sore as all get out. And none of us were up for the hike. But there was a young guy, call him a young buck there, who was fresh out of the military, a deer hunter, loved to hike. He said, well, I'm going up there. We said, okay, we stuck 2 sticks in the road vertically to form an X. Look for that, and that X marks the spot where where we experienced that. So he goes on the hike, comes back running into camp, and says, I think I found a footprint. I found a footprint. I need to get a casting kit. I want to go up and cast the footprint. So he took one of the other expedition members of the larger group expedition who was very experienced in casting footprints. And they went up there, lo and behold, found this massive single footprint. Did what they needed to do to cast it. And as they were waiting around for the cast to solidify, they started looking around the area. And a little further back up the hill, they found another partial Bigfoot print. And then for the first time, keeping in mind that all we did was look uphill, they looked downhill to the left of the road. And as they were looking downhill, they found a partial footprint right on the berm, or right where the road broke to a steep decline. And right beside a tree, and they looked up this tree, and about 15 feet up on the tree, there was a bark tear. Sometimes Bigfoot's Sasquatches will tear off bark. So they were amazed. They couldn't cast the partial print on the berm, the side of the road, or the other partial print in the road. But they looked down over the edge of the drop, and about 8 to 15 feet down, the drop plateaued off into a level area that was wide and it was long. And when they looked down there, they counted about 30 juvenile Bigfoot prints on that plain. So if you believe that was a Bigfoot encounter, and the more I tell the story, the more I begin to believe it was. But if you if you believe that was a Bigfoot encounter, it looks like when George pivoted on his heel to ask me something about hypnosis, we accidentally stopped either next to a playground or next to a nursery where the youngsters were hanging out. And again, if you're following the belief that it was a Bigfoot encounter, rather than a landslide happening, we could have been bluff charged and been hearing one or multiple Bigfoots coming down the hill towards us. I say, if you think it was or believe it was a Bigfoot encounter, I say that in the name of science, because we never saw the Bigfoots during that event until we saw the eye shine. Well, the folks from the cabin saw the eye glow as we were hiking down both the fire road or forest road and down the steep incline. And then we saw the peepers. But scientifically, we've got to hold ourselves to a higher standard. And so we didn't conduct any experiments. We didn't have a clear Class A experience. It had been raining heavy the night before. And so there is a possibility that the tree could have been a rotted tree that just fell down and came partially rolling down the hill. He brought that cast back, and I believe that cast was 18 inches long and 8 inches wide. And it was an awesome cast. He let it solidify longer and then clean it up. And when you looked at the cast, you could see each joint of the toe bones in all 5 of the toes, except for the great toe, where one of the sections of between 2 joints didn't make an impression, but then you could see the great toe above that. And you could see the dermal ridges on that foot cast. And you could also see the mid-tarsal break that's characteristic of a Bigfoot. So that's my fight flight story. And wow, I'm noticing that we're got less than 10 minutes left in our podcast. The stories took longer than I anticipated. So rather than moving on to just kind of tease you about what'll be coming up. We'll just fast forward to kind of tease you about what's coming up in the next episode. We're going to actually take a look at the physiology behind fight flight responses. Take a look at that. I'll try and have another fight flight story much shorter so that we can actually get to this. And then depending on time, we will begin to look into and talk about the different behavioral and psychological techniques that you can use to recondition your fight flight response and remain reasonably aroused. You don't want to be calm, limp, and loose if you're having a Class A experience, but you also don't want to lose your poop or get scared stiff. So we've got just a few minutes for questions. Anybody have any questions about the story? I apologize for not getting to the science part, but between the introductions and comments and the stories, we've just about eaten up all of our time today. But next week, a briefer fight flight story, and we'll get into the physiology behind fight flight and begin to discuss how you might learn to modulate or control that. I got a question from Charlotte J. Dr. Baranchak, were you open about your search for Bigfoot while still practicing? Absolutely. And I'm still open. Like I said, I still haven't had a Class A experience. So from a scientist, as a scientist, a psychological scientist, I've got to say that I won't say for sure they exist until I see one up close and personal, or I run some experiments to prove their existence. So I'm still open to woo, I'm still open to flesh and blood, and I'm still reluctant to say they definitively exist, although I will say I believe they do. And yes, I was open to it when I was practicing it. And unlike a lot of professionals, I've never been shy about telling people that this was an interest. Other questions? No? Alrighty, let me just check back and make sure I didn't miss any during the presentation. No, I didn't. Well, I want to thank you very much for your attention to these rather lengthy. Joe Mulligan, do you know of any reported sightings on Kennesaw Mountain here in Atlanta, Georgia? I do not. But I'll tell you, I always thought that you'd have to hike 15 miles back into the wilderness. Most of the expeditions that I've been on, we've stayed at either state or national parks or wildlife management areas, and then just hike 1 to 3 miles back into the woods. So you don't have to go deep back into the woods to have an encounter. I think I'm going to wrap it up from here. I want to thank you for your attention. I hope you'll come back next week to learn more, after a short story of fight flight, learn more about the physiology and begin for us to discuss how you might alter your fight flight response. And it looks like it's going to move into a 3-part series. In the meantime, I'm going to ask you to keep your mind open, your boots on the ground, and your heart open to your higher power. And I am going to say good night.
I see you running out of reason. Don't try to blame it on the season. Why you wanna walk away? When we began, swear we had something that would last. Baby, has a feeling past. Falling in was easy. How do I make it stay? I'll never let go of you. Tried and true. Oh, I'll never let go of you. Tried and true. Was I a fool? I know sometimes I may wonder, but I would never leave asunder a thing as good as what we have. Is it a rule? What's good is worth the fighting. There ain't no denying that you and I were made to last. Falling in was easy. How can we make it stay? I'll never let go. to the start. I'll never let go of you, tried and true. I'll never let go of you, tried and true. Tried and true.
Wanna do it all with you by my side. If you're in, meet me here tonight. Be brave and come along, I'll be your ride.